name is Katie Holdway, and I'm a postgraduate researcher in the Department of English at the University of Southampton. And today I'm going to be talking to you about Introduction to the Victorian Novel. Now, we all know, or at least we think we know, what a Victorian novel looks like. From its dimensions and its aesthetics to its contents, it is a form about which we have a series of expectations. When you think of a Victorian novel, perhaps you think of an iconic penguin classic with its trademark black and orange livery and an old painting of somebody severe glaring out at you from the cover. Perhaps you think of something long, dull and heavy, a tome worthy of the task of propping a door open. Perhaps you think of something stern and moralising that you were dragged through by the ears at school, full of soot and chimneys and industry. Of course, all these things can be features of a Victorian novel. However, this module moves away from the idea that they are immutable characteristics, viewing them instead as merely the surface of a complex, colourful and often surprising phenomenon spanning genres, forms and time periods. While some novels were and remain heavy doorstop tomes, many were published in instalments on a thin tissuey paper that made them lighter to carry about and to share than a magazine. While some had stern, moralising contents, others delighted their Victorian audiences because they were frothy, funny, romantic or sensational. Throughout this course, we will interrogate, reappraise, contextualise some well-known and some less well-known texts to challenge our assumptions about what Victorian novels were like and, crucially, what the real communities of Victorians that engaged with them were like also. Victorian readers were just as enthusiastic, heterogeneous and complicated as the texts they devoured by the thousands. These were readers who laughed until their sides split at the satire in William Makepeace Thackeray's Vanity Fair. Readers who, legend has it, crowded into the harbours at Manhattan to wait for the ships bearing copies of the final instalment of Dickens's Old Curiosity Shop to find out whether Little Nell had died or not. Readers who also reserved the right to censure novels as much as they praised others, like, for example, Queen Victoria's first Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, who in his critical remarks about Oliver Twist declared, "It's all among workhouses and coffin makers and pickpockets. I don't like those things. I wish to avoid them. I don't like them in reality, and I don't wish them represented." During the course, I also want to take the opportunity to discuss the Victorian novel as material culture, as a meaningful object, as well as rather than simply a repository for a narrative. What did Victorian novels feel like? What were they made of? How much did they cost? And what did these factors mean for how they were encountered? In 1837, the year Queen Victoria ascended the throne and where our narrative begins, the literary marketplace was buzzing with new life, but reading remained an expensive pastime, even a luxury that many could not afford. In the 1830s, it was common for a novel to be published in a 3-volume format like this, often known as the three-decker. Until the 1830s too, most books would come with a grey cardboard cover that the wealthy would have bound to match the style of their library. The Victorian novel was, in many ways, an index to your affluence and your identity, as well as to your reading habits. Can be telling too, and if we look at some of the titles published in 1837 and their prices, we can begin to see just how inaccessible buying a novel in volume form would have been for many. For example, if you were looking for some light and frothy fiction with all the scandalous details of the luxurious life of the aristocracy, known as silver fork fiction, you might turn to Benjamin Disraeli's 1837 novel Henrietta Temple. For something more serious, you might choose Mary Shelley's latest novel, Faulkner. If you wanted to buy a copy of either of these, however, each would cost you a whopping 31 shillings and sixpence. Now, at this time, as Sarah Wise tells us, an East End silk weaver would earn between 5 and 10 shillings a week, and a skilled master carpenter or tailor would earn about 30 shillings. The price of a novel could therefore be 3 times your week's wages or even more. When we compare this to the price of cheap gin, which was 2p for a glass or 10p for a pint, it's easy to see why some working class people chose to spend their spare change on something other than reading material. Even if you managed to acquire a book, you had to be able to find both time and a place in which to read it. For the working classes, this meant that after 12 hours working in a shop or a factory or a mill, potentially 16 on a Saturday if you were a shop assistant, you would often have to find time in the evening to read, which would require a source of light. Even the meanest sort of candle, the tallow dip, a form of ill-smelling lighting made from rushes dipped in animal fat, would not burn for very long, would often spit at you. You'd normally only get about 2 to 3 hours of light and was generally but a poor light source. Such candles were 7p for a pound, which gave you about 2 dozen, and working class families would want these to last for a week or more. So you could either buy a book or you could light your house. And if you didn't light your house, you were unable to read. So the inaccessibility of the novel in novel form during the early part of the Victorian era and the clear market for something cheaper means that we can see narratives being deconstructed and reconstructed in lots of different ways to place them within the reach of a variety of different audiences. These processes of deconstruction and reconstruction begin to render what at first feels like a relatively sturdy module title with its key terms Victorian and novel a bit unstable. Let us take, for example, the Pickwick Papers. Now, surely this is emblematic of the Victorian novel. It's over 700 pages long. It is written by arguably one of the most famous Victorians, Charles Dickens, and its plot follows a series of old middle-class gentlemen as they wander around the country, philosophically observing the workings of society while eating and drinking far more than is good for them. And yet, as Adam Abraham has facetiously argued in response to John Sutherland's claim that the Pickwick Papers is the most important single novel of the Victorian era, and I quote, his point is compelling, but Pickwick is not Victorian and it is not a novel. Abraham's argument might sound like splitting hairs, but he does have a point. Pickwick was published in 20 monthly numbers between March 1836 and November 1837, and Queen Victoria ascended the throne in June 1837, over halfway through its serial run. Each number was small, thin and light, presented with several illustrations and bound in a thin blue wrapper, like the second image on this slide. Some issues of Pickwick are also surrounded by advertisements, like you would expect to find in a magazine. Now, each of these monthly parts cost 1 shilling, a much more affordable price than 3 volumes of Disraeli, but still out of reach for some, including those with lower levels of literacy. For this reason, the serial was deconstructed further. Sections were reprinted in newspapers, for example, which at this time cost anything between 4 and 7p rather than a shilling. The third image on this slide shows the front page of a daily metropolitan paper, the Morning Post, which printed a section of Pickwick in the bottom right-hand corner, which I've highlighted here, and this was very, very common. Newspapers could also be acquired in a variety of places. Public houses, for example, would often take several metropolitan and provincial papers that would be passed from hand to hand and read aloud to those who could not read for themselves. So you could get at least some Pickwick for the price of a drink. As well as all this, at the cheapest end of the scale, spin-off publications, such as the Penny Pickwick, as the name suggests, costing just 1 penny per number, made the substance of the text even more affordable. And running parallel to these various texts, which offered ways of acquiring at least something of the substance of this Victorian novel, were theatrical adaptations, poems, songbooks, and bizarre themed memorabilia, ranging from hats and pens to chintzes and corduroys. Now, the point of this example is threefold. Firstly, it suggests that to understand the significance of a given Victorian novel, we need to ask what happened to it when it was published, who read it, in what context, and what other sorts of texts and cultural moments did it prompt. Secondly, it shows that even the terms Victorian and novel are ones that benefit from close scrutiny, and for this reason this course will include plenty of opportunities to map, analyse and debate their uses and meanings across different texts, genres and forms. Finally, this example shows that the Victorian novel did not always resemble the kind of bound book with which we might automatically associate it, and the form had a significant impact on the text's meaning and reception. Now on this slide, you can see the primary text we will be reading for this module at the rate of 1 per week over the course of a total of 6 weeks. We begin in 1837 with Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist, before moving on to Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey. We'll then look at Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, George Eliot's Silas Marner, Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet, before ending in 1893 with George Gissing's The Odd Women. Now they're all shown here in the Oxford World's Classics edition I recommend for the course, but on the next slide here you can see the periodicals in which some of them were originally published, which varied widely in terms of form and content. So Oliver Twist, for example, was published as part of a monthly periodical called Bentley's Miscellany, where it was printed alongside lots of other tales. North and South also was serialised in another periodical Dickens edited called Household Words, and Gaskell and Dickens had some furious arguments about the form that her writing should take to fit the serialised house style. Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet was first published in Beeton's Christmas Annual, which, as well as being the first story of the now world-famous detective Sherlock Holmes, included drawing room plays and other entertaining texts aimed at families celebrating the festive season. Even those published in volume form have some wonderful stories to tell. The Odd Women, for example, was published in 3 volumes, just at the point in the 19th century when the 3-decker format was meeting its demise. And Gissing wrote a great deal about the emotional strain of stretching content into 3 volumes to benefit a reading public that, on the other hand, seemed hungry for content that was cheap, short and frothy. Chosen are also deliberately short to limit the reading load while maximising the discussions we can have. In fact, the longest of them, North and South and Oliver Twist, are just over 400 pages long each. Each session will begin with a lecture-style overview of the week's texts and its contexts, and in the second half of the session, which will be dedicated to a collaborative and highly interactive seminar, we will work with extracts from the text so that we can have detailed discussions about each writer's use of language and bring in lots of supplementary material, including newspapers, coins, plays, illustrations, reviews and cheap fiction, as well as thinking about the magazines and periodicals that were the first home for many of these Victorian novels. In this respect, this module is not just about looking at the rich narratives woven by these texts, but about looking at their place in the world as a formative part of the politics, the culture and the economics of the Victorian era. It is also about both production and reception. We will look at the decisions authors made when shaping their novels, what kinds of real readers engaged with them, and what they thought about them when they did. I'd be very happy to answer any questions you might have about this module via email at k.v.holdway@salton.ac.uk. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you will consider joining me on Introduction to the Victorian Novel in the autumn.